The sound of the bank doors locking shut rang out at the exact moment Vivian Hartwell set her pen to a $300 million contract. 1 second earlier, the entire marble lobby of Crownbridge Federal Bank had belonged to her. Lawyers bent over leather-bound files. Press cameras waited beyond the glass doors. The branch manager smiled nervously, aware that Vivian's signature could shape the future of this place. The escrow representative had the seal ready. Every eye in the room was fixed on the pen hovering above the final page. Then 3 men in black masks walked in. One raised a gun toward the ceiling. On the floor, everyone. His voice wasn't panicked, it had been rehearsed. Everything Vivian had ever used to control the world around her, money, title, a team of lawyers, bodyguards stationed outside the door, thick stacks of contracts, vanished within a single breath. She dropped to the floor along with everyone else in the room. A few steps away, a man in a worn brown jacket stayed standing exactly half a second longer than everyone else, as if calculating something before letting his body fold down. His name was Samuel Reed, 44 years old, a single father. A man who had come to the bank that morning only to wire his 21-year-old daughter's final semester tuition. A man Vivian's eyes had swept a slot for less than a second when she walked into the lobby, immediately filing him under ordinary customer. The kind of person who always stood at the slower teller line, wore older clothes, and gave a CEO like her no reason to remember his face. But Samuel wasn't afraid. He didn't lunge forward trying to play hero. He didn't shout out some useless act of defiance. He simply knelt down a beat slower than everyone else, set the leather folder holding his bank documents beside his right foot, nudged a chair a few inches out of line with his knee, and let his keychain slip from his hand and clatter onto the stone floor as if his hands were trembling with fear. Vivian saw every one of those movements. She didn't understand what they meant, but instinct, honed over hundreds of the tensest negotiations of her life, told her this man wasn't actually shaking from panic. He was calculating. One of the 3 robbers swung his gun straight at her. "You, the CEO, stand up." Vivian went cold. She realized they knew exactly who she was. This was not a random robbery. Samuel lifted his eyes at that exact moment. His voice was low, even, nothing like the voice of a terrified hostage. "She can't open what you're after." The gunman spun around, the barrel now aimed straight at Samuel. He looked down at the floor like a man in absolute terror. But the next sentence out of his mouth made the entire room stop breathing. "There's a second vault. It's not on this bank's public floor plan. I know the way in." Vivian stared at him. She had no idea whether the man was signing his own death warrant, deceiving the robbers, or deliberately pulling the entire robbery toward himself, so everyone else would be safe. All she knew was that the man she had dismissed in under a second was now beginning to steer the entire room through details so small that no one else even noticed them. And if he made one wrong move, she would be the first to pay for it. Samuel Reed, 44, was a single father and a former hostage negotiation and civilian rescue specialist who had worked high-pressure crisis situations for a federal unit, handling kidnappings, armed robberies, and other dangerous emergencies. After his wife's death, he left the field to devote himself fully to raising his daughter, living a quiet life doing small-scale safety consulting, unwilling to let his child grow up beside a father who kept vanishing every time an urgent call came in. Vivian Hartwell, 39, was CEO of the Hartwell Dominion Group. Sharp, cold, decisive, accustomed to controlling every room she entered with money, legal teams, and razor-edged strategy. On the day of the robbery, she was preparing to sign the acquisition of Northgate Relief Systems, a $300 million emergency relief technology company. At first, she saw Samuel as someone entirely unremarkable, but the robbery forced her to reconsider. A person's true worth has nothing to do with the clothes they happen to be wearing. Naomi Reed, 21, was Samuel's grown daughter studying criminal justice and emergency crisis management. Naomi knew her father once had a dangerous job in the past, but she didn't know the whole truth. She was the very reason Samuel was at the bank that morning, to wire her final semester's tuition. Later, Naomi would be the one who helped preserve the audio recording, analyze the security camera timeline, and push her father not to disappear back into silence after saving an entire room full of people. Victor Crane, 52, was the chief financial officer of Hartwell Dominion and the true villain behind the entire scheme. Victor didn't want Vivian to complete the Northgate deal because he was secretly working with a rival investment fund to force the company into selling off its emergency relief technology division at a bargain price. The bank robbery was the perfect incident he engineered to blow up the deal, tarnish Vivian's reputation, and seize temporary control of the company. Elias Rook, 41, was the leader of the robbery crew. He wasn't some criminal who'd wandered in on an unlucky day. He was a former contract security officer who'd been fired, hired to carry out a robbery designed to fail on purpose, except the real target was never the cash. It was the blue escrow key inside the contract signing room. Trent Vale, 38, was the second robber, hot-tempered and prone to losing control. Trent was the greatest danger in the group because he didn't know the full plan. All he knew was that there was money to take and someone who'd have to answer for it if things went wrong. Samuel had to read every breath, every flash of anger, every lapse of discipline in him to keep violence from erupting. Milo Sutter, 33, was the third robber, responsible for the entrance and the camera system. Samuel drew his attention away with a string of small signals: the position of a chair, the leather bag, the dropped keys, deliberately staged noises, and the secondary alarm system in the service corridor. Claire Monroe, 48, was Vivian's lead attorney. She held the entire signing file, the contract documents, and the escrow paperwork, and later became the one who built the legal chain of evidence against Victor, from Samuel's phone recording, the secondary cameras, and the system's routing logs. Police Captain Raymond Holt, 56, commanded the officers who responded to the scene. At first he assumed it was an ordinary bank robbery. He later realized Samuel was the very man who had once taught a crisis response course he himself had attended years earlier. He refused to let the press turn Samuel into some reckless daredevil, instead publicly crediting Samuel's restraint-based tactics with minimizing casualties. Marissa Kane, 45, was the bank's branch manager. At first, she worried only about the bank's reputation and Vivian's contract. Later, she was the one who handed over the service corridor camera footage and the secondary alarm logs, openly admitting that the bank had ignored numerous security warnings simply because it didn't want to inconvenience its VIP clients. Northgate Relief Systems was the company Vivian was trying to acquire. Its technology supported missing persons searches, disaster relief coordination, and frontline worker protection during emergencies. So the deal was never just about money. It was tied to a system with the real capacity to save lives. The story opens at Crownbridge Federal Bank, in the heart of the city. Vivian Hartwell was about to sign the contract to acquire Northgate Relief Systems. The deal would move Hartwell Dominion into the emergency relief technology sector while blocking a rival private equity fund that was waiting to snap up Northgate and carve it into pieces to sell off the technology licenses individually. Outside the bank, reporters had gathered early. Inside, lawyers, the branch manager, the escrow representative, and a handful of ordinary customers waited their turn. Samuel Reed stood at the regular teller line to wire Naomi's tuition. He wore his worn old jacket, held an envelope with the tuition receipt, and wore a military watch on his wrist with a strap faded by the years. Vivian's eyes passed over him for less than a second, before she forgot he existed entirely. To her, the world had always been divided into two kinds of people: those relevant to her deal and those who were not. Then the bank doors locked. 3 men in black masks appeared. One controlled the entrance, one controlled the crowd, and one moved straight toward Vivian's area. They ordered everyone to the floor, phones out of their hands, heads down. This was the first time in her life Vivian felt total powerlessness against the very authority she'd always held. Her security detail stood outside because bank policy forbade weapons inside. Her lawyer could only clutch the stack of documents. The branch manager went white as paper. Samuel held on to a startling calm. He didn't resist at all. He lowered himself down like any ordinary hostage, but his eyes never stopped reading every detail of the room. The position of the security cameras, the reflections in the glass doors, the distance from the stone columns to the teller counters, the blind spot of the robber standing near the entrance. He began adjusting things that seemed meaningless, nudging the leather bag, deliberately dropping his keychain, shifting a chair, tipping a trash bin near the walkway. Vivian slowly began to realize that these small, seemingly random actions were quietly reshaping the entire flow of movement through the bank's main lobby. The most hot-tempered robber picked Vivian as his example to make everyone else afraid. Since she was the most recognizable person in the room, Samuel immediately cut in with a carefully calculated lure. There was a second vault, one that appeared on none of the bank's public floor plans. The robber's attention snapped away from Vivian at once. Before being led away, Samuel stood up, pretending to comply obediently in order to lead two of the robbers into the service corridor at the back. Before he left the main lobby, he glanced toward Vivian for one brief moment, as if to warn her. "Say nothing, don't break the rhythm he'd just built." The story rewinds to the morning before the robbery. Samuel lived in a small house in the suburbs with Naomi, 21. Naomi was studying criminal justice and emergency crisis management. She hoped to work in disaster relief and crisis response, having grown up watching a father who kept an extraordinary calm whenever everything around him fell apart. Samuel wasn't wealthy. He did safety consulting for small facilities, sometimes picked up unarmed security shifts, and occasionally taught conflict de-escalation classes at local schools and community centers. He'd once had a far bigger career, but he'd walked away from it after his wife died, and a mission nearly kept him from getting home in time when his daughter needed him most. Naomi knew her father had some history connected to a federal agency, but Samuel always told her very little about it. He didn't want his daughter's image of him built on dangerous stories. He wanted her to remember the dinners they shared, the rides to school, the times he was truly present, not the times he vanished without explanation. That morning, Samuel went to the bank to wire Naomi's final tuition payment. She told him she could manage the rest with her part-time job. Samuel firmly refused. "I can't give you everything in this world," he told her, "but I can keep this one promise." Naomi reminded her father never to disappear into silence again if something happened. Samuel just smiled softly, with no idea that her words would become a prophecy only hours later. Meanwhile, Vivian was preparing for the signing. She was under pressure from the board to prove the Northgate deal was the right call. Victor Crane, the CFO, argued the deal was too risky and pushed to delay the signing, but Vivian wouldn't budge. She believed Northgate needed to keep its original relief mission intact, not fall into the hands of an investment fund waiting to slice it up and sell off the licenses. Before leaving his office, Victor made a short phone call. "Just make sure she doesn't get to sign that contract today." At the same moment, Samuel walked into the bank. With his daughter's tuition envelope in hand, Victor's people already had someone planted inside the bank, posing as an ordinary customer, waiting for the signal to seal the doors shut. This section returns inside the bank, going deeper into how Samuel handled the entire crisis. He had no weapon in hand, no authority to command anyone. He couldn't recklessly charge forward, since too many innocent people were within range of danger. The only thing he had was the ability to read people and space, a skill forged over years of facing genuine life-or-death situations. He secretly recorded audio with his phone, placed face down beneath his feet, its microphone angled toward the robbers. He faked trembling to disguise movements that were, in truth, entirely deliberate. He deliberately dropped his keychain right where the door guard would be forced to step over it if he needed to move quickly. She shifted a chair to create an obstacle between the main lobby and the exit route. He tipped over a trash bin to narrow the line of sight for the gunman. Vivian watched every detail. At first, she thought she was simply imagining things. But as the robbers were repeatedly forced to change position because of these small obstacles, She began to understand that Samuel was quietly building a maze in the middle of the bank lobby. Samuel told Elias Rook about the existence of a second vault. This wasn't entirely fabricated. Years earlier, he'd worked as a safety consultant for a bank within the same network, and knew that some branches had a secondary service vault with its own separate alarm system, unconnected to the main alarm network. He led Elias and Trent into the back service corridor. Along the way, he deliberately brushed against a secondary alarm control panel mounted low on the wall, a signal that would be sent directly to a private security line, completely separate from the main alarm system the robbers had already disabled. He also intentionally left small traces behind: a pen dropped in a corner of the hallway, a faint key scratch along the baseboard, a scrap of tissue wedged into a doorframe so police could later trace their route. In the back room, Samuel dragged out time with fabricated procedures, a manager's verification code, a non-existent secondary lock malfunction, a string of pointless verification steps. The robbers grew more agitated by the minute, while the distant wail of sirens drew steadily closer. Trent realized the secondary vault held nothing like the money he'd imagined. He raised his weapon and aimed it straight at Samuel, screaming that he'd been played. Samuel had been waiting for exactly this moment. In the back room, Samuel didn't fight the way action movies would have you believe. He used precisely what he had quietly built up beforehand: the tight geometry of the space, the small obstacles, the exact timing, and his opponent's natural reflexes. The moment Trent lost control, Samuel twisted his body to knock the gun's aim away from the door, pinned his wrist against the wall, and threw him completely off balance. Elias lunged to help his partner, but was shoved by Samuel into a tight corner where he couldn't bring his strength back. The entire exchange was fast, decisive, bloodless, focused purely on efficiency and total control. At the same moment, a special tactical team moved in, alerted by the secondary alarm system. Milo, stationed at the front, heard breaking glass and police commands, and instantly lost his nerve. He was arrested right by the door before he could use any hostage as a shield. Everyone in the bank lobby was rescued safely. Vivian was still kneeling on the floor when daylight poured in through the shattered glass doors. She watched Samuel being led out of the back corridor, still holding on to that same startling calm, as if he'd just finished a job that needed doing, rather than having just saved an entire bank full of people. Police began taking statements. Samuel said very little. He mentioned only that he'd once been trained in some useful skills. He turned down every interview request, avoided the television cameras, and slipped out a back door before the press could turn him into the hero of the moment. Vivian looked down at the scattered contract papers on the floor. She realized the robbers hadn't been after ordinary cash at all. One of them had asked very specifically about the blue escrow key and the file containing Northgate's ownership transfer terms. That meant whoever was behind this robbery knew far too much about her deal. Claire Monroe immediately checked the paperwork. The escrow token code in Vivian's file had been partially copied. Fortunately, Samuel had pulled the robbers away from the scene before they could obtain full authentication access. Vivian listened to the recording Samuel had quietly captured. In it, Elias said one short line to his partner: "Crane says that file matters more than the cash." Vivian froze. Crane was her CFO's last name. A few days later, Vivian went to find Samuel. Not at her office, not through a press event, not by sending an assistant in her place. She met him in person at a small coffee shop near his neighborhood. She thanked him. Samuel looked visibly uncomfortable with her gratitude. He said he'd only done what needed to be done, because someone in that room was going to die if no one redirected the danger elsewhere. Vivian asked how he could stay so calm in such a dangerous situation. Samuel told her part of his past. He'd once worked in a unit specializing in hostage rescue, trained people in crisis response, worked in places where a single wrong move could cost an innocent life. After his wife died, he decided to leave that career to become a real father. Naomi had needed a father who actually showed up for dinner, not a hero who could be called away at any moment. Vivian offered him the position of head of security for Hartwell Dominion, with an extremely generous salary. Samuel refused outright. He didn't want to return to a life where every crisis became his personal responsibility. He didn't want Naomi to grow up once more beside an absent father. "I didn't leave that work because I stopped being capable," he told her. "I left it because my daughter needed me more than any title ever could." The words hit Vivian hard. Her whole life she'd believed every problem could be solved with money, power, and title. Samuel had just shown her that some things could never be bought: time, presence, and peace of mind. Naomi arrived near the end of the meeting and recognized Vivian instantly. She was polite but guarded. She asked Vivian bluntly whether she'd come to thank her father or to borrow him as a nice story for the press. Vivian couldn't answer right away. The question forced her to look hard at herself. Vivian said she had no intention of turning Samuel into some symbol to exploit, but she needed his help figuring out how the robbers had known so precisely about the blue escrow key. Samuel answered, "Then don't start with the media. Start with real evidence." Claire, Vivian, Samuel, and Naomi worked together to reconstruct the entire timeline. Naomi wasn't some tech prodigy. She was simply very good at analyzing data and emergency timelines. She helped synchronize every point in time: when the doors locked, when the main alarm system was disabled, when the secondary alarm was triggered, the dialogue captured in the recording, the bank's camera footage, the file access logs, and even Victor Crane's phone call. Marissa Kane provided the service corridor footage. One clip showed Milo, the third robber, entering the bank the day before disguised as a maintenance worker, quietly surveying the camera positions and the main alarm control panel. Claire dug further and discovered that Victor Crane had requested, at the last minute, that the signing location be changed from the law office to the bank, citing escrow security as the reason. That single change was what placed Vivian exactly where she'd be most vulnerable to a lockdown. Samuel listened back to the recording and realized the robbers hadn't behaved like a crew after ordinary cash. They kept asking about the file, the key, the witness to the transaction, the notarization code. They'd been hired to seize a legal instrument that would make the deal collapse entirely. Northgate Relief Systems had a special clause. If Vivian failed to sign within the designated escrow window, a rival fund called Blackstone Vale Partners would gain the right to trigger their own competing offer. Victor stood to profit directly through a shadow consulting contract if that deal went through instead. Raymond Holt confirmed that Elias Rook had once worked as a contract security officer for a company linked to Blackstone Vale. The deposit money for the robbery had passed through an intermediary account directly tied to one of Victor's people, but they still lacked one piece of direct, undeniable evidence. Naomi found, buried in the recording, a faint notification sound from Elias's phone, a robotic voice reading out, "VC has updated the route." She wasn't ready to claim outright that it was Victor, but she pointed out that the update occurred exactly 5 minutes before Vivian walked into the bank. Samuel proposed a plan: set a trap to make Victor believe the blue escrow key still wasn't properly secured. Vivian decided to hold the signing again, this time in front of the entire board and investigators. The second signing took place at Hartwell Dominion's headquarters, in the glass conference room on the 40th floor. The full board was present. Northgate's representatives were there as well. Lawyers, a bank representative, an independent auditor, and plainclothes police officers all sat in the room, without revealing their true roles. Victor believed Vivian was scrambling to salvage her image by rushing to sign again, and he thought he could still prove the post-robbery chain of custody had been compromised, invalidating the escrow key. Samuel didn't stand beside Vivian like an ordinary bodyguard. He stood near the back, close to the door, reading the whole room exactly the way he had inside the bank. Exit, routes, sightlines, who was growing impatient, who was unnaturally calm. Victor struck first, right in front of the board. He declared that Vivian had lost her judgment, letting a stranger with tactical experience interfere with the signing process and compromise the escrow chain of custody. He proposed a temporary transfer of executive authority to protect shareholder interests. Vivian didn't lose her temper. She let Claire lay out the entire case. Piece by piece, the evidence came forward. The recording from Samuel's phone, the service corridor footage, the secondary alarm logs, Victor's email about changing the signing location, the payment trail to a contractor linked to Elias Rook, a recorded call between Victor and the shell company, and the terms of Victor's financial stake if Northgate fell into Blackstone Vale's hands. Victor tried to deny it all, calling it nothing but baseless speculation. That was when Samuel finally spoke. He didn't tell it like some hero's story. He simply described the robbers' actual behavior. They never looked for cash, never asked about the main vault, never questioned any customer's account. They asked only for the exact things that someone inside the deal itself would know to ask for. Naomi presented the audio timeline she'd reconstructed. She synchronized the notification VC has updated the route with Victor's phone location data and the elevator camera footage from company headquarters. It proved, beyond doubt, that Victor had sent updated instructions to the robbery crew at the very moment Vivian was en route to the bank. Raymond Holt walked into the room with a warrant in hand. Victor tried to argue that he'd only wanted to delay the signing, never intending for anyone to get hurt. Vivian answered flatly, "The moment you hired armed men to walk into a room full of hostages, you lost the right to call it a delay." Victor was led away. The board swiftly voted to strip him of all executive authority. The Northgate contract was signed successfully, but Vivian didn't smile in triumph. She looked toward Samuel and understood that this signature only existed because one ordinary man had refused to let that room die in silence. Once things had settled, Vivian still wanted Samuel involved in building the company's safety program. This time she didn't offer him some grand title that would force him to give up his life with Naomi. She asked him what he wanted to build. Samuel proposed something called the Calm Community Initiative, training for frontline workers at banks, hospitals, schools, and community centers on how to recognize a crisis early, de-escalate tension, protect the vulnerable, and properly trigger secondary alarm systems when needed. The program wasn't designed to turn ordinary people into heroes. It taught them how to survive, observe, coordinate smoothly, preserve evidence, and keep a crisis from getting worse. Naomi became the program's first participant, handling timeline reconstruction, communication protocols, and psychological support for crisis survivors. She told her father plainly that she didn't want him going back to his old profession, but she wanted the knowledge and experience he'd built up over the years to stop disappearing into his silence. Vivian established a support fund for the victims of the bank robbery, covering therapy costs, legal assistance, and lost income. She also required Crownbridge Federal to overhaul its entire security process, bodyguard policy, backup alarm systems, staff training, and a formal channel for customers or ordinary citizens to report warning signs. Samuel kept his small life exactly as it was: the old house, the old car, dinners with Naomi, no television interviews. But he agreed to become a design partner for the program, since the work didn't require him to become a public symbol. A year later, the training center officially opened. There was no flashy ceremony. Those present included former hostages, bank employees, medical workers, teachers, night shift workers, and building security guards. Vivian said in her remarks that on that day, she had thought she was looking at an ordinary man caught in an extraordinary situation. In truth, she had been looking at a man who had chosen an ordinary life after living through far too many extraordinary ones. Samuel's remarks were far shorter. Don't teach people to become heroes. Teach them to stay calm long enough for everyone else to still have a way home. Naomi stood behind him, listening to her father speak, and for the first time, she no longer saw his past as something that had stolen him away from their family. She saw it instead as something that could now protect countless other families without ever taking away their dinner together. This story isn't simply about a single father who managed to stop a bank robbery. If we look at it only that way, we miss the most important part of the whole story. Samuel Reed didn't become valuable the moment people discovered he'd once been a hostage rescue specialist. He had been valuable long before that, when he stood in line to wire his daughter's tuition, when he wore that old jacket that no one bothered to notice, when he chose a smaller job just so he could be present for every dinner with Naomi, when he lived an ordinary life, not for lack of ability, but because he understood the true cost of a life spent constantly being called away to save others. So many of us look at an ordinary person and think we already know their entire story. A customer standing in line, a father wearing a worn-out jacket, a man of few words, a man who never boasts about his past, a man with no bodyguards, no press, no team of lawyers trailing behind him. But people are never just what they happen to be wearing in the moment we glimpse them. Vivian learned that lesson in a room where money no longer meant anything at all. She had once believed that power was the ability to control every game in play. But inside that bank that day, the person with the truest control wasn't a CEO, wasn't a lawyer, and wasn't the one with the largest bank account. It was the one who stayed the calmest. The one who understood that not every crisis needs brute strength to solve it. Sometimes shifting a single chair a few inches can save a life. A set of keys dropped at the right place, at the right moment, can buy an extra half-second that matters. A recording hidden beneath the floor can bring the truth into a courtroom. The right words at the right moment can pull a gun barrel away from someone entirely innocent. None of that is magic. It's discipline. It's experience, accumulated over years. It's a life that paid a heavy price to learn how not to panic when everyone else around you is panicking. But this story is not in any way encouraging ordinary people to throw themselves into danger to prove their worth. Samuel never wanted to be a hero. He only wanted everyone to survive and get home safely. That is an enormous difference. A good society isn't one that needs more heroes. A good society is one that builds better systems, so that fewer and fewer people are ever forced to become accidental heroes in the first place. That's exactly why the true ending of this story isn't Samuel accepting a security chief title with a 7-figure salary. The real ending is a training program that teaches frontline people how to recognize danger, stay calm, protect those more vulnerable than themselves, preserve evidence, and call in the right help before a crisis turns into an irreversible tragedy. Real justice isn't simply that Victor got arrested. Real justice is that next time, an ordinary bank employee will know exactly where the backup alarm system is. A teacher will know how to defuse a dangerous situation before it explodes. A building security guard will know how to hold a door without sending the crowd into panic. A CEO will learn to listen to people who carry no title at all. A father will no longer have to leave his daughter every night, just to prove he's still useful to the world. Naomi came to understand something enormously important as well. Her father hadn't hidden his past out of shame. He'd hidden it out of fear that it would once again pull him away from his family. And perhaps a father's love sometimes isn't found in charging straight into danger. It's found in knowing exactly when to walk away from danger and come home to his family instead. This story leaves behind a question for everyone listening to it. Have you ever underestimated someone simply because they were standing in an ordinary line like everyone else? Have you ever assumed that a quiet person had nothing remarkable inside them? Have you ever believed that someone in an expensive suit must matter more than someone wearing a worn old jacket? Don't wait for a bank robbery to happen before you finally see the true worth of the person standing beside you. Don't wait until someone saves an entire room full of people before you remember that they too once had a family, a past, a private pain, and a legitimate reason for choosing to live a quiet life. And if you too have walked through the hardest places, done things no one ever knew about, chosen a smaller life just to protect the people you love, always remember this. You haven't lost your worth simply because you no longer stand in the spotlight. Sometimes the greatest strength isn't walking straight into danger. It's walking out of it, building a peaceful home of your own, and using only what you know to help others find their own way home safely.